Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
Welcome to another episode. I'm your host, Duncan Barkes, in the Taxpayers Alliance studio. We have the TPA's Will Yarwood. Hello once again, Will.
Hi, Duncan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Good to see you as always. Looking very smart. I might as well just explain to our listeners you're suited and booted. Nice little pocket chief there as well.
Yes, thank you. The pocket square is a lost art.
Pocket
and
square,
although
yeah.
mine is not as nice as our fantastic guests,
Yes.
I do try and elevate it
Well,
in
would
some
you
way.
like to introduce our fantastic guest?
You know what, Duncan? I may as well. I've known this young man for a little bit now, I think, actually. It's Fred de Fossard, formerly of the Legatum Institute, now the Prosperity Institute after their recent rebrand. So, Fred, thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, and you look very smart, Fred. So I can only apologise for my Barber Chelsea boots, my Levi's, and my slightly baggy shirt. I feel a bit of a miss. I didn't get the memo.
Good afternoon, chaps. Thank you very much for having me. Without plugging, I will say Oliver Brown is a great tailor. We love Oliver Brown.
Well, we'll send you the invoice. Right, ton of stuff to talk about. We want to talk about you, Fred, in more detail. We'll do that a little bit later on. You've had a really interesting career so far. We'll also talk about the rebrand and why it's happening and some of the objectives behind the organisation, Prosperity Institute. But first off, I think it's only right, on the day we had an early morning press conference from our Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, 8:30 this morning, talking about the Southport killings, previously referred to Prevent, Axel, as we know him as. We know this. Starmer said, I knew all about this, but it would have been improper and it might have prejudiced the trial if I'd explained this or mentioned it beforehand. Will, we'll start off with you. Does any of this wash with you?
I started listening to it this morning, and some of the things the PM was saying was certainly washing with me. The fact that he said that we need to sort of get over our cultural sensitivities and nothing else, and nothing like that should get in the way in the future. But the issue is, in typical Starmer way, because of course he's a lawyer, he immediately went to a legalistic framework where the issue is there aren't the correct laws in place, there isn't the correct kind of independent advisors and observers in Prevent dealing with this kind of stuff, and the way to solve all of this is actually just more bureaucracy and more legalism. And I think the worst part of this is actually Starmer refused to mention the fact that, refused to talk about whether this is a problem with integration or immigration or things like that, and immediately went to the hobby horse of the current government and the last government, which is online censorship, because apparently the real problem is that someone like this had access to that kind of stuff online, and I don't disagree, obviously that kind of stuff shouldn't be online in the first place, but nevertheless it's just showing that they're using this as a hobby horse to push their own authoritarian ideological agenda, which will increase censorship online across the UK.
Fred, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very, very intense, sensitive issue, and I agree with Will that the intention of doing an investigation into what happened with this case is correct. Some of the Prime Minister's rhetoric was definitely welcome, but devil is in the detail, not just in what they're suggesting, but also what they haven't been talking about. So another review into Prevent. We had one a couple of years ago done by William Shawcross, which was actually a very, very good review. The Tories, despite making many errors in government, one of the final things they were doing was trying to implement some of the findings in this review, where Shawcross made a point of identifying that Prevent was going after the wrong targets. It was doing this whole thing into supposed right-wing extremism, which is responsible for essentially zero deaths, well, not zero, but very, very small numbers of deaths, and deprioritizing Islamist jihadi extremism. Now, of course, the Southport murders were not about that. But what is quite clear is that Prevent came across this boy many times. He had been taken out of a comprehensive school. He'd been was in 2 special schools, I think, and taken out of them for persistent, sort of violent, threatening, arguably psychotic behaviour. He had shown a great interest in genocide, the history of genocide, all this sort of stuff. And yet, for some reason, he wasn't then passed on to whether it's the mental health services. I mean, a huge lack of discussion here is we're not talking about the secure accommodation and care of people who are simply this disturbed. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, was talking about needing to take away things from the internet that he was reading. He was reading about history. But how can you delete Wikipedia? How can you move away from him obsessing over genocides in recent history? These are things that we're taught in school. So I think the government's response to going on to the online radicalization stuff, or even just reading about nasty things online, is a great missed opportunity, because instead they should be looking at how are genuinely disturbed, dangerous people allowed to roam around and commit acts of violence.
Yeah, completely. And also the problem is, his own father had consistently referred him to Prevent and didn't do, and obviously they didn't do anything about it. So actually there needs to be not a question about whether Prevent needs to change. It's actually a question of whether Prevent's fit for purpose in its current form, and whether a new institution or a new organisation needs to be set up, or frankly that the state needs to take some of the control back and the Home Office needs to do some of this stuff itself.
That's interesting. I mean, we're recording this podcast on a Tuesday afternoon in SW1. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, as we speak, has been in the House of Commons, and she said that Axel Rudakabana was found to have carried a knife more than 10 times, including one that was bought on Amazon. She went on to say the fact that he was just 17, he was easily able to order a knife on Amazon. That's a total disgrace, and it must change. What do we think of that?
Well, I mean, look how many times the government has banned so-called zombie knives. We keep on banning the purchase or holding of types of knives, and it doesn't seem to stop the knives being purchased or bought. Amazon is a shop. There are shops all over. There are shops online. There are shops in person. Yes, I understand there are justifiable restrictions on buying knives, but to make this again about online retail, I think is insane. When in reality it should be about criminal justice.
Your thoughts, Will?
Yeah, I completely agree with Fred on that. Again, as I said earlier, this is just them attempting to push their favourite ideological hobby horse. And this isn't necessarily just to do with the last Labour government. I mean, the last Tory government also talks a lot about online censorship rather than actually dealing with the more deeper issues that Fred just outlined there. To be cynical, I mean, not like me to be cynical at all, Duncan, but to be cynical, I genuinely don't think anything worthwhile is going to come out of whatever Starmer and Yvette Cooper is going to put forward, and I don't think it will possibly prevent horrible things like this happening in the future.
Okay, and just one more thought on this from you both. Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, said the following: the Prime Minister is once again hiding behind the contempt of court argument. This is simply untrue. The country needed to know the truth about this murderer, and that he was known to the authorities. Even MPs were banned from asking questions about this man's background. Cover up Keir convinces no one. Is he right to make those comments?
Right, he is on his way to being right, I think, to an extent. There's a thing in Parliament called the sub judice rule, where the Speaker has the ability to suspend parliamentary privilege, though MPs can't talk about things which would prejudice a trial. That is why MPs weren't able to speak about it. But I sympathise with Mr Farage's point, because he wasn't asking for information about the suspect himself. I do not think MPs themselves would be asking questions which would have been dangerous of prejudicing a trial. I do tend to trust MPs. I think MPs were interested in looking at the information that the government had, which then informed the government's own communications, its responses to things like the riots, its decision to say what it said about people rioting, and its accusations around things like terrorism. And what we've seen here is there's a lack of trust because of an information vacuum. And I appreciate that only a certain amount of information can come out at the same time, but when we have large gaps, many months in this case, between incident and trial, and then complete the no dissemination of information allowed in a highly online information age, maintaining that kind of information control by the state, I think, is very difficult. Yeah,
quite, and also leaving that vacuum allows for disinformation to spread. I mean, all of the disinformation that it came between that vacuum that Fred just outlined, a lot of that was proven to be just not the case and not true. And actually, if the government wanted to nip this in the bud, as soon as it happened, they should have just released the information that was necessary to plug that vacuum, in order so that disinformation didn't spread, which again would then further justify their online censorship stuff, saying, oh, there's been disinformation online. Yes, because you refused to release the information, which would have prevented that kind of disinformation and would have provided clarity to the British public, to the press, to politicians, and so on and so forth, so that people could understand what the truth of the matter really was.
Information doesn't flow via newspaper and broadcast TV anymore.
No, not at all. It flows from online.
Really interesting to get your thoughts on that. We'll talk about Trump a little bit later on. You might have noticed there was quite a significant event that took place in the USA yesterday. But also, well, I just wanted our listeners to be aware of something else that's happening this week, which is a cracking bit of campaigning by the Taxpayers Alliance. You packed up your troubles in your old kit bag and you went off to Windsor and Maidenhead.
Yes, and we smiled, or frowned as the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead is raising council tax by a whopping 25%. The Liberal Democrat ran council there. They're accusing the last Tory administration of running the finances into the ground, and therefore, instead of cutting bureaucrats and council waste, what they're doing is punishing local taxpayers with a tax hike that a lot of them just simply can't afford. So we've got our team on the ground at the moment as we speak, knocking on doors, handing out leaflets, getting people to sign up to our council tool where members of the public can type in their postcode and indeed send a letter to their councillor explaining how they do not want this hike to happen. So we're going to be doing that for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And yeah, it's TPA back on the ground in the new year, and it's great to see our team enthusiastic about it. But I'm here in SW1 doing the air war rather than on the ground war.
But it's important people understand some of the groundwork that the TPA do. And if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, then that is the reason why you should support the Taxpayers Alliance, because of that kind of campaigning that really makes a difference. Fred, let's talk about you in more detail. Now we've looked at a couple of issues, and we will look at Trump shortly, or certainly before the end of the podcast. The rebrand, the Legatum Institute, now the Prosperity Institute. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, one thing I will say is that this rebrand idea has been in the works for a very, very long time. So I've been at the Institute for just coming up 2 years. I think the discussion around a change of name has been going on essentially since the Institute was founded. Always about working out what is the best way of communicating our message and our mission. Prosperity, of course, has been the centerpiece of what we have been doing since 2007. The Global Prosperity Index is essentially our flagship product and has been for a very long time. When Radomir Talcoat, the managing director, and I both joined in spring 2023, after we had been working together as special advisors under the Johnson then Truss governments. We both worked for Jacob Rees-Mogg, great man and a friend of the TPA, I'm sure. One of the things we thought that needed to be changed at the Legatum Institute was how we did the Prosperity Index. So it was paused for 24 and was going to return in early 2026 with a rejuvenated approach to prosperity and the analysis of it. And then for our sort of domestic policy work, which is something that we have really put the rocket boosters underneath for the first time, I think, since the Special Trade Commission, the work that Shankar Singham and Radomir himself were actually doing on Brexit and trade policy. And we think, obviously, prosperity is something that people historically associated with the United Kingdom. The richest country in the world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not quite the richest country in the world anymore.
No.
Prosperity has to be our defining focus, not just for the British centre-right, but the entire British political class. And we want to be the think tank that really leads it. That's why I put it on our name. And you might notice a logo has changed. We used to have this fabulous chariot with an archer on the chariot itself being drawn by horses. We're keeping the archer because, after all, the archer is pointing up for the long run.
Yes.
That shot into the distance, the moonshot, you could say it. We want to riff on Trump going to Mars. That's a sense of our ambitions. So Prosperity Institute is, and it's good to start 2025 with the change.
All right, so this rebrand, if you like, has got nothing to do with our Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, phasing out Latin in the education system.
A great line. I mean, I confess I did not know what Legatum meant when I first came across the Institute. My Latin education is shaky. I think I had about 2 hours of declensions when I was a teenager. No Latin in me at all. I will also say a few times I've been interviewed, people mispronounce the name. So prosperity is easier.
Yeah, it is, and it does what it says on the tin. So, I mean, you've rebranded for 2025. What are the kind of bits of campaigning you're planning to do this year?
So, it's a great question. So what we have a mixture of focus on the immediate term rigmarole, let's call it, and then also the big long-term structural reforms. As the think tank, now the sort of the centre-right, as it were, is in a period of opposition. Obviously, we're not affiliated to the Tory party, but we come from the right. It's the time to focus on slightly longer term work. So in my area that I cover, the sort of broader economic, regulatory, prosperity work, as it were, we're doing some work on trade policy, which is a very topical one because there's all these discussions about US-UK trade, the UK-EU reset. Tariffs, yeah, exactly. Are the tariffs a legitimate threat by Trump? Are they a bargaining tool? What part of Britain will get affected? We do have a trade surplus with America in goods and services. A big one in services, a small one in goods. So that could be an interesting thing to look into. We'll also be looking looking a lot more at net zero, because I think the wheels are coming off the net zero train quite rapidly. We've been going through periods of Dunkelflute, as they call it, where our grid is under considerable strain. We were one power plant tripping away from a blackout only a couple of weeks ago, or maybe even a week ago, because our renewables are just not providing the energy required. This is also having a deleterious effect to British industry. Our chemicals industry is vanishing before our eyes. Our automotive industry is going to vanish because of things like the EV mandate, as well as net zero energy policies. So the prosperity hangs in the balance. And that's in the short term. And then the longer term stuff is working out, well, there must be root and branch legislation reform. There must be root and branch reform to things that have been implemented in Britain since 1997. And the advantage is we now have time to sit down and write them.
Understood. There's nothing there, Will, that you would disagree with, is
No,
there?
not at all. I would hate to disagree with Fred on a podcast anyway.
All views are welcome.
Indeed. No, I absolutely agree. And I agree with him on the prosperity front. I mean, obviously we'll talk about Trump later, but actually there was a moment last night where the division between what Britain is now like and what America will likely be like in the next few years really was stark to me. I was on my way home on a dirty tube line, and it got stuck halfway through because a tube in front of me decided that its doors weren't going to work anymore, and this made the entire tube delayed by not 30 minutes, not 40 minutes, but up to 50 minutes to an hour. I didn't end up getting home till about 7:30 in the evening. Crowded tube, full of misery. And what have I just come back from? I've just come back from Trump talking about wanting to take America to Mars and wanting to reverse the decline. And that, in that moment, for me, it was like, wow, we have one country, a nation that is wanting to take itself to Mars and renew its prosperity and its energy, and our country can't even run a train correctly. It is beyond depressing. So I think the work that the Prosperity Institute will do on this kind of stuff, investigating what Britain needs to do to be more prosperous, will be a very welcome addition.
Yeah, it's a very different tone to 22 billion pound black hole.
Yes,
I know we're at the Taxpayers Alliance. We've got to take public finance seriously. We've got to get public debt down. Britain spends £100 billion a year servicing her debt obligations.
Yes,
that's insane. But the way we get through that is to work out how do we actually put those rocket boosters on the economy.
And the way we get through it is not by talking this country down or the economy down from your first day in Downing Street, which is exactly what Keir Starmer's done, and ditto Rachel Reeves. Before we look at some of the challenges and opportunities in our political world, I was told, Fred, when you were coming on this podcast, one of your hobby horses, and I say this with respect, I was told to mention to you ESG rules. For those people listening, would you like to explain?
ESG rules are environmental, social and governance rules and principles which have really taken over economic, financial and government thinking in the last 20, 30 years. I wrote a paper last year called Woke Capitalism, Diagnosis, Prognosis and Cure, which essentially charted the development of the ESG and the diversity industrial complexes in the second half and 20th century into the early 21st century, and the damaging effects they've had on not just economic growth, but freedom of expression, freedom of association, and what we can do to move away from them. I think it's important to look at it right now because Donald Trump, in one of his many executive orders, two of his many executive orders yesterday, he got rid of DEI in the US government. The diversity page on the White House and federal government websites have all been deleted immediately. And he also announced that America was going to drill, baby, drill. Restarting the fracking revolution that powered the American economy out of the financial crisis so effectively. And Will was talking earlier about the divergence between Britain and America. This probably will strengthen it, because at the moment we have a government here which is seemingly more connected ideologically to ESG and DEI than ever before. The Financial Conduct Authority, the regulator for financial services, has this wild policy in the works at the moment where it wants to mandate reporting requirements with an eye towards ratcheting to hiring quotas on diversity grounds for all financial services companies, not even publicly listed companies, but literally startups which work in finance. That is mental. And this is a policy which they have admitted is going to cost in aggregate around £1 billion, which I'm sure is an underestimate. And they still want to go ahead with this kind of thing. Meanwhile, the United States is aggressively pursuing a policy of structural reform for competitiveness. Another executive order, which I read about this morning, says all state agencies are going to be mandated to find cost of living reductions for American citizens through things like housing supply. through things like deregulation, through things like cutting the cost of energy. That is a sort of up the stream structural reform, which is just not being discussed in this country at all. And part of it is the dominance of things like ESG rules. It's the dominance of ideas that actually the government does need to put its hand on the scale of free markets. It does need to direct money into things it likes. But that comes with huge opportunity costs, huge administrative costs, and regrettably, when it comes to the environmental stuff, money being put in the wrong place. Instead of working out how do we cut our energy supply by taking even a French approach to energy, development of a whole nuclear fleet, we're putting more and more money and doing more subsidies through contracts for difference into fundamentally intermittent power supply, which, as I said recently, is on the edges of fraying.
The Trump inauguration, I mean, it was nuts, and I say that in a good way. It's been a fascinating 24 hours. Will, is Donald Trump, is he the saviour?
I wouldn't go so far as he's a saviour in some ways, because of course there's no saviour other than Jesus Christ, of course. But nevertheless, I think that Trump is showing that there is a clear difference between how he ruled in 2016 and how he's going to rule now. Yeah. He didn't know really what he was doing going into 2016. Now he has a clear, concise programme of what he wants to do, how he wants to do it, and what order he wants to do it. And he has a very large selection of advisors and political people behind him who will help him get that through. To go back on Fred's ESG point, I actually have a direct question for Fred about this, because I'm very interested in it too. Obviously in the United States, Trump can just sign executive orders banning this kind of stuff. We don't have that in the UK, really. And also we don't have the political class or the sort of their willpower to do this kind of stuff. Even with lots of Conservatives, a lot of them bought into this stuff quite a few years ago. I mean, look at the way that Conservative politicians funneled money into Stonewall, for crying out loud. In the UK, how on earth do you actually manage to reverse the sort of DEI industrial complex, the ESG industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, and how do you make sure that it's not caught up in, legislative nonsense and, potential even opposition from courts and judges?
Great question, right? So in some respects, the steps to do this in Britain are actually quite simple, and others very, very hard. So we'll start with the simple ones first, which is a huge amount of this can be done by secondary legislation called statutory instruments. That's essentially our version of an executive order, but it's not quite as exciting as a president signing it. But if you look at some of the webs of laws, for example, the public sector equality duty. This is one of the right's most hated bits of the Equality Act. The public sector equality duty applies to all public bodies, but the government or minister can add or remove a public body as he or she wishes by statutory instrument. That's literally just minister making an order, one quick vote in Parliament, sometimes not even a vote. Sometimes you can put this thing in Parliament, and if no one prays against it, which is the term to oppose it, for 40 days, it goes through. And the Lords do not oppose statutory instruments. So we actually have large amounts of powers. So if you thought it was too difficult to repeal the Equality Act, which would require a new Act of Parliament, you could start removing public bodies from the equality duty with ease. So why on earth is the armed forces bound by the public sector equality duty? Why on earth is a financial conduct authority whose job is to stop banks crashing bound by the public sector equality duty, for example? So that's a way in which you could start just ticking these things off. Similarly, there are powers under the 2006 Companies Act to add or remove burdens on company directors. So you can just remove those burdens. You can say that a company director of whatever sort, whether it's a pension fund or a plumber's business, only has to pay due regard to the honesty of his accounts and basically put it back to traditional financial reporting requirements. At the moment, there's a big web of non-financial reporting requirements like the gender pay gap reporting, sustainability stuff, more disclosure agreements. All of these things, almost all of them, can be pared back with our version of executive orders known as statutory instruments. Now, where it gets difficult is twofold. One is a statutory instrument can be judicially reviewed, unfortunately, but then if they're written properly and they're done within correct power of the Parent Act, the minister doing it will usually be fine, but there is a small amount of legal risk. But of course there is legal risks to an executive order in the United States as well, and ultimately if you do an Act of Parliament, which takes longer in this country, you can't judicially review it. So you always remember you have the power of an Act of Parliament. We tend to write long bills of about 100, 200 clauses, which take ages to get through. I would recommend doing smaller bills, which you can get through Parliament, both houses, way quicker, and they're ironclad against judicial challenge. But the final thing, this is the hard hurdle, is the people and the political class.
Yep.
It's and that is a longer term fix that involves recruiting a new cadre of motivated people. But that is something that the Republicans faced as a huge challenge they faced in 2016, because you just talked about Trump not really knowing what he was doing. That's true for 16, 17. It took ages to get his appointments in. Many of his appointments weren't capable or very good or loyal or whatever. And the period between him losing in 2021 to now has been a period of reflection and learning and realising we've got 4 years to solve the problem for the next administration. And I think part of that was building the people, was building the movement. And this is something I hope all British people on the right take heed from.
I think they do. Listen, let's talk about you in a bit more detail. You, special advisor to Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg between 2020 and 2022. What was that like?
Sir Jacob is a truly wonderful man to work with. In a way, just like his public persona, but more so, but even kinder, more interesting. A great man to debate with, a great man to talk about literature, history, the Bible, politics, constitutional reform. We really saw eye to eye on pretty much everything. And conveniently, we're both from Somerset.
Right.
So whenever things got a bit, whenever we didn't know what to talk about, we could strike up an "Are you right, my lover?"
Yeah.
How do you remember your time in Bath?
Yeah.
And,
well, where's the best place to get a pint of Buckham ale?
Buckham, indeed.
Yeah.
Or Thatcher's Gold. So, many, many good things to talk about. And honestly, a great minister to work for. What I particularly liked about working with Jacob is that he read everything. He read everything more carefully than I did, so I sometimes felt my job as an advisor to him was slightly superfluous because he read all the annexes, which I hadn't. Hard to catch him out. But the best thing was he would really enjoy debating your advice. There are great moments when, one advisor, two advisors, and a private secretary might have three totally different recommendations for him as a minister. Yeah. And, we'd spend 20 minutes hashing it out. But the most important thing is once he made his decision, which I think is quite often quite rare. Ministers can flip-flop.
Perish the thought. I'm going to ask you a question we asked another former SPAD who was on last week's podcast. We had Giles Dilnot on, editor of Conservative Home, was special advisor to James Cleverly when he was Foreign Secretary. We're going to focus on the Conservatives for a second now. What would you advise Kemi Badenoch to do right here, right now, regarding where she needs to go of her party?
Focus relentlessly on finding out what happened to those 2019 voters. Because if you look at the data, it's really, really interesting. The largest, so obviously I'm saying for the 2019 voters who then left 2024, Conservative vote roughly halved. So we need to look into those people that left and why. And those are the people the Conservative Party needs to urgently connect with if it wants to start rebuilding trust. It needs to focus relentlessly on them. The attention at the moment is on the people that drifted to Reform because they were the largest single chunk. But a really interesting chunk, I think, which is worth more investigation, is the people that did not vote. Because all analysis and research shows now the Conservative to Reform was the largest switcher. Conservative who did not vote was the second largest switcher, and the numbers of people going straight over to Libs and Labour were tiny in comparison, and then obviously a tiny number of people in Greens as well. So those are the people I'd focus on, and for the purpose of maybe doing something slightly more interesting and different, is to really try and find out why those people stayed home.
You mentioned Reform. How much of a threat do you think Reform, or rather, how much of a threat is Nigel Farage's Reform UK to the Conservative Party?
I think a very large threat, partly because Farage is a charismatic and dogged campaigner who knows how to build a platform and a platform. But also, first past the vote voting system is a very interesting dynamic when you're the centre-right party. I'm still instinctively supportive of first past the post because I don't like the anti-democratic post-election horse trading that happens in a PR system. And actually, we saw elements of that with the coalition agreement, which I think was actually quite bad for British politics. So I don't want to do that, focus on that. But where the centre-right party sits in first past the post is really interesting because the centre-right party, I think, needs hegemony over the right before it can start looking at the centre to win over. The Conservative Party has never had a party to its right in Parliament to the extent it does now. And there are 5 MPs to the right who got 4 million votes, which was around 15%. In 2015, I think David Cameron was clearly knew this threat because he managed to squeeze UKIP down to about 13%, thanks to things like the pledge to the referendum on EU membership, long-term economic plan was a sort of hard as nails, actually austere economic platform. There was a lot tough on crime. One thing I remember in 2015, there was big focus on deporting foreign offenders. There was a massive Linton Crosby Cameron policy. And never forget, a pledge to repeal the Hunting Act, which did very, very well for Conservative voters in the countryside who might have been considering UKIP. So that was a very, very effective tool to monopolise right-wing voters before getting other centrists who were disillusioned with the Liberal Democrats and Ed Miliband in 2015. If the Conservative Party does not think strategically like that and chases, let's say, a sort of phantom centre or doesn't work on its right flank, then I think reform will be very dangerous.
A fun story to end this episode of the podcast. It's about air fryers. I never thought we'd be talking about air fryers on A Nation of Taxpayers. More than 6,000 pensioners will be given free air fryers in North Lincolnshire. Apparently the council have already delivered more than 1,000, with a further 5,000 due to be sent out over the next few weeks. Someone who received it in Scunthorpe said they had not used their oven since the air fryer arrived because it was, quote, marvellous. Now, we're not here to debate the merits of air fryers, but this is all due to the fact that we know that the winter fuel payment's been scrapped. There's this government initiative called the Household Support Fund, and for those who do not receive pension credit and therefore get the winter fuel payment or other means tested financial support, it's like, here you are, Doris, or Dave, I don't know, here's an air fryer. Now, Will, with your Taxpayers Alliance hat on, where do you stand on this?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to announce that I've been so ever since working at the TPA, I am so immune to council stories and councillors doing nonsense things now. It really used to really rile me up, but now I just roll my eyes and think, oh, really? Again? Are they doing this? Yeah, look, it's not the job of a council to provide air fryers to pensioners. It's like, I understand the concerns about the winter fuel payment, I really do. But also, the British social contract is not, young men like me paying a marginal rate of tax of 40% so that Glenda and Brenda can have free air fryers from their council. Sorry, that's just not the case. Councils, this is not the job of a council. Why aren't they collecting bins? I'd love to see how many backroom council bosses this lot have. Yeah. I'd love to see how many virtually backroom bosses these guys have got, and whoever concocted this idea so they can get nice little hits in the BBC like that. But yeah, I'm not surprised anymore of councillors doing this kind of stuff. But my God, people, can everyone just calm down and stop talking about the winter fuel payment as if it's been some sort of the worst policy that's ever been implemented ever? And actually, we need to start thinking about how we can allow younger generations to thrive and not constantly pander to a generation of people that has been pandered to quite a lot over the last 14 years.
I love having you on this podcast because people can't see your body language and they're getting quite animated. It's like we should rename it the Zoomer Bites Back.
Zoomer Bites Back.
What do you think, Fred, on this?
As a millennial, not a Zoomer, my view is therefore slightly more tempered. I think a couple of things. Although I sympathise with William's description of the social contract entirely, I think a couple of things here. One is, an oven is the most energy-intensive thing in a household typically. So if these people had stopped using their oven, they probably would have been able to afford to buy the air fryers, which are really cheap, with the energy savings. So do some people call that dead weight loss? I'm not sure. I'm not an economist, but I think that's a waste of money from the council there. And the second is isn't it a Conservative council, and Reform do quite well in Lincolnshire? Maybe they're worried about the local elections.
Listen, Fred, it's been a real pleasure having you on this podcast. Thank you for coming in. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future. Fred de Fossard from the Prosperity Institute. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Will Yarwood, as always, from the Taxpayers Alliance, thank you, and thank you for listening. Do us a favour. You can spread the word about this podcast, A Nation of Taxpayers, far and wide. If you like us, follow us, share us. Other people get to hear about it. And if you want to get in contact, you can send us an email as well. It's podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Thank you for listening.